Dan Lanning and the coaching staff are looking at some big-time recruits in the class of 2023. We check in on the status of some of those big names after the spring game. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again, Duck fans, for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin, D1 play-by-play broadcaster and lifelong Oregon Ducks fan. Thank you for making this your first listen or your first view if you're watching on YouTube every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, which I'm rocking with the t-shirt today. Your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks every single weekday. Like, comment, subscribe wherever you're listening to or watching the show right now. And we're talking recruiting today. And who else am I going to bring on for recruiting but John Garcia Jr., the director of recruiting for Sports Illustrated, back once again with a little bit of a different setup than he's had if you're watching here on YouTube. And John, I see some intriguing memorabilia there behind you.
Yeah, we're at the home office, so got my college jersey, got the high school jersey on the other wall that you can't see. But I'm a well-traveled sportsman and been a sports fan my whole life. So I've got even more stuff behind the backdrop there. So yeah, it's a good place to look around when I get distracted from writing all day.
Yeah, I suppose I never actually asked you what your football background was, but just in having met you via chat here on YouTube, I should have surmised that you played football at some point in time. But speaking of football, the Ducks had a spring game over the weekend. And we've done player evals and just takeaways from the game. We've been doing that all week. But one thing that Dan Lanning stressed going into the game and seemed to be a pretty solid success was the impact that it would have on recruiting and the guys that he would bring in. And there are a bunch of names that we're looking at going into the game. And now we'll take a look at kind of where Oregon stands with them. A lot of five-star guys that Oregon's looking at in the class of 2023, which I, as a Duck fan, like to see because I want to see the staff swing for the fences because that's kind of what we've been promised since they've been assembling themselves over the last couple of months. But let's start right off the top with Jayden Rashada, who was going to come to the spring game, as we had talked about. And then at like the very last minute, like a day or two before, he ended up going to Ole Miss instead. What kind of happened there, and where does it leave Oregon in his recruitment?
Well, I think this is a good example of how important these spring game visits are because a lot of schools were campaigning to get Rashada on campus this past weekend, and it was really the last huge weekend of spring games. I think next weekend there's only like 3 or 4 nationally. So, yeah, last week Oregon had its spring game. Ole Miss also had its spring game, and throughout the week, both coaching staffs at one point or another were expecting Rashada to visit their school. And of course, Oregon was the plan for the bulk of the week. And as you mentioned, Spencer, right before he jumped on a plane, basically, he jumped on a plane to Oxford. So he went south instead of north and spent the weekend at Ole Miss. It was an official visit, the first official visit that he took. So obviously, optically on the front end of that, as a Duck fan, you're like, oh no, the top quarterback target was supposed to come here, ended up going there, spending time with Lane Kiffin, official visit. I'm sure most recruiting fans have seen the Rolls Royce photos, all of that fun stuff that happens on an official. So you're very kind of understandably pessimistic based on Friday, Saturday, even into Sunday. But then we get to Monday, and this is where it becomes quite interesting because Ole Miss got a quarterback commitment on Monday, but not from Jayden Rashada, from Marcel Reed of Tennessee, who was also there over the weekend and has been a frequent visitor to Ole Miss over the last several months, really dating back to the fall, given his proximity to Mississippi. And there's a lot of conversation now as to what the plan is for Ole Miss. And this is independent of Oregon, but is obviously related here. Will Ole Miss take 2 quarterbacks? If so, what does that do for Jayden Rashada's recruitment? Obviously, he's aware that the Rebels took a quarterback. I'm told by my sources in the SEC that they could take 2 quarterbacks, but I'm also told that the plan isn't 100% drawn out. So it's not 100% that they will take 2 quarterbacks. And obviously, they just took one in Marcel Reed. So naturally, most quarterbacks are going to kind of move on. I don't know how quickly that will happen for Jayden Rashada, but the news Monday versus Friday for Duck fans has to be amazing, right? Because now you're going to get another visit from Jayden Rashada, which was probably going to happen either way. But now maybe the primary contender, which was Ole Miss, now that is a diluted option for Jayden to at least some degree, whether they're still waiting to make that decision on taking two quarterbacks, or if obviously if they don't, then obviously Rashada is out for Ole Miss, which is huge news for the Oregon Ducks. And obviously a big national battle for Rashada. Texas A&M recently offered as well. He wants to visit College Station before all is said and done. He was at Arkansas. He was at Miami. So this is a true national battle for Jayden Rashada. But if Ole Miss is no longer involved, that is a huge plus by default process of elimination for the Oregon Ducks. And again, they will get him on campus again, regardless. So I do think the scenario, the feel from Friday to Monday, probably polar opposites for Oregon Duck fans, and rightfully so, as we have since moved on the last couple of days. There's still plenty of Jayden Rashada love at Oregon and vice versa, as we've come to find out. So the Ducks are still in this thing, and I think they'll be in it until the end.
And the other thing to consider with Ole Miss is they added Jackson Dart from USC in the portal this offseason, and he has, correct me if I'm wrong, at least 3 years of eligibility remaining, right? Is he he
Right.
could he have 4, or does he just have 3?
He's got 3 years of eligibility remaining, and he's in a battle with another sophomore, so another second-year quarterback. So even if Dart doesn't win the job against Luke Altmaier, it's probably a situation where there's going to be a multi-year starter, maybe one hits the portal kind of deal. So you understand where Ole Miss is kind of on the fence on, do we bring in a second quarterback, or do we just lock in on this Marcel Reed, develop him, because the quarterback room after the winners declared in this race is going to at least optically feel set for not only 2022 but 2023 at least.
The other quarterback Oregon has, I feel like, kind of picked up a little bit more steam around is Dante Moore from Michigan. I saw him a little bit more as an afterthought offer, but his name has started to gain traction amongst the Ducks. And, when Nico Iamaleava committed to Tennessee, I think that's when the names started to be more closely associated, Oregon and Dante Moore. So where do the Ducks stand with that 5-star quarterback, also class of 2023?
That's another one who's going to take a visit to Eugene before all is said and done. Dante is probably the most well-traveled quarterback in this class of 2023, even just of late. He not only has taken his own select visits, but he was on a bus tour that hit like 11 different schools in the South. But in terms of his true visits, he's been down to Miami a couple of times. Notre Dame, Ohio State recently hosted him. And then he just took an official visit last weekend to LSU around their spring game. And really came off of it pretty excited. He got to spend time with Joe Burrow for like half of the day on Saturday, which any quarterback recruit would love that, especially at LSU, where Joe obviously, made his historical run. So LSU is going to factor into this thing. He's long been recruited by Brian Kelly. We understand that, but Brian Kelly's old school. Notre Dame has been viewed as the favorite for quite some time. But as time goes on, Dante keeps taking additional visits outside of that Midwestern footprint. And the kid's from Detroit, if I hadn't mentioned that. So there was this early feeling that he was going to be just a classic Midwestern Big Ten kind of recruit. Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan State, Notre Dame. One of those is going to grab him. And I think before the coaching carousel, that was probably what was going to happen. But I think all of that movement slowed his process down. And in that time, other schools like Oregon have now come in and made a splash in this recruitment to the point where they're going to get him on campus for an official visit, which is really all you could ask for. Prospects only get 5. We assume Dante's 5 will be outside of that Midwestern region because he's so familiar with those schools for the most part. So I think that bodes extremely well for Oregon to shoot their shot. This will be kind of an all-encompassing, Kenny Dillingham extravaganza, like the whole 48 hours. I'm assuming Dillingham's going to be with Dante. And now you cover your own bases where you're not all in on just one quarterback. You're certainly courting Rashada very much, and it's a long-standing recruitment. And then the new recruitment of Dante Moore is something that you need to go all in for to stay in the hunt for him, because he's got really an undetermined timeline for making a decision. So his recruitment can go about as long as any other quarterbacks in the class of 23, which is a good thing for Oregon. You want him to be willing to extend that process. So a lot of things are lining up for the Ducks, and they're covering their back by courting multiple quarterbacks. And Dante Moore, Jayden Rashada, I mean, these are two of the 5 or 6 best in the country, no matter how you look at it. So this is an ideal starting point for the Ducks. They're going to get both on campus, despite the transition coaching staff. And I think at this point, that's really all you could ask for.
I want to ask you about another recruit from the state of California who might be one of the guys, should Oregon get one of these quarterbacks, that they'll be throwing the ball to. But first, I want to tell you all about Built Bars. And you know that I love them. And I love mint brownies, and they're loaded up in my golf bag. And summer is coming. And with summer, you're going to need some food on the go. For me, that's on the golf course. For other people, it might be hiking. It might be going on long runs. Whatever it is, you need something, and Built Bar is the best way to do it. 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, 17 grams of protein, way better for you than a candy bar. Don't get fooled and think that a Snickers bar is actually good for you because it's got a peanut in there. It just that's not a thing. Go to built.com, use promo code LOCKED15, get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. Next up on the recruiting pursuits for the Ducks at the wide receiver position is Jurion Dickey, who we've mentioned here on the show. He was at the spring game over the weekend, one of several guys who was on campus to watch Dan Lanning's first spring game in Oregon. After that game, he has said that he's going to announce his commitment on May 2nd, which is Monday, as we record this on a Thursday. What is Oregon's position right now with Jurion Dickey?
Well, you got to love the timeline here where, we said with Dante Moore, slower the better for Duck fans. It's the opposite for Jurion Dickey. It's like the sooner he's ready to commit, the more likely he's going to pick Oregon. And I think making that visit and then making the declaration of setting that commitment date for Monday bodes extremely well for the Ducks. He's fresh off of that time, as you mentioned, with Dan Lanning, seeing that first on-field product, but also got more time with Dillingham, who we just talked about, Junior Adams, the wide receivers coach, who he's known for quite some time. He was recruiting him out at Washington before this current coaching staff was developed. So I do think that Oregon has really been the school to beat in this race for quite some time. And of course, Dickey was being recruited by the previous Oregon staff as well. So a lot of things do line up here positively for the Ducks, especially relative to the timeline. You got to track the visits in recruiting. It's really still kind of the bread and butter for what we do. And when we have to make some of these predictions and projections, the visits really do tell us a lot of the story. And obviously, Dickey is extremely familiar with Eugene. There is a lot of Pac-12 competition in the race. Washington is in it, the school we just mentioned previously. I think UCLA at one point felt good about where it stood. And then Penn State's kind of the outlier in this race. I don't imagine he's going to end up in the Big Ten. I think he's a Pac-12 kid. He's a California kid. And for me, this race, was largely about staying in state or going to Oregon. And I think the in-state options have obviously changed. There's been a lot of fluctuation there as well. And the familiarity with Oregon is really hard to overcome in my mind leading into this commitment right after seeing Eugene one more time. So I would be surprised if Dickey wasn't a Duck by the time we talk again.
Potentially some good news there for Duck fans. And he's class of 2023, correct?
Yes. So, I mean, he was going to begin kind of this class with Casper and these guys that you start pairing together. But of course, Casper reclassifies. But again, another example of why Junior Adams has this strong and kind of growing reputation over the last few years.
Another guy who Oregon would love to have offensively, and again, his name I think has become more associated with the Ducks in the last couple of weeks, and that's Richard Young, 5-star running back. Where's Oregon stand with him?
Well, they're going to get him on campus this coming weekend. There was a plan for him to get to the spring game. I'm not sure why they fell through, but Richard confirmed earlier this week that he's back to Eugene this weekend for an unofficial visit to see the Ducks. It's a school that he's been wanting to get to for quite some time. I know he's tight with Carlos Lachlan, who's been in the South before this move, recruiting at places like Florida State, where Richard was a target, since he was a freshman, and even at Western Kentucky. So I think that relationship is something that Richard is going to see through and give Oregon their fair shot in this recruitment. But another heavyweight battle right here. Alabama, Ohio State, both at times have trended for Richard Young. There's other schools closer to home that are trying to keep him in the fold as well. But there's really no indication that he's ready to make a decision. He wants to take more visits to get more of the evaluation in. So obviously getting out to Eugene will be important for him, and just trying to figure out where the Ducks stand on his end, because the relationship with Lachlan is there. I think the relationship with Lanning is there, another guy who obviously was recruiting the South in years prior. But you got to get out there. You got to see it. You got to experience it. Richard is from Lehigh Acres, Florida, which is in the Fort Myers, Naples area, Gulf Coast, not as big of a metropolitan area as maybe some would think outside of the region. So I do think that the sort of college town feel would be something good for him in terms of Eugene versus some of the other schools that he's looking at. So I do think there are appealing elements to Oregon. And Richard's a bit of an introvert. Like, he isn't a big talker. He does not love talking to us in the media. He kind of understands he needs to, but it's not something that he gets totally excited for. Very much an internalized type of kid who's got that ability to kind of do his own thing. He's definitely not going to be one to just follow any kind of recruiting wave if another school's trending for a random reason. He's always going to be the type to kind of do his own thing. And if you're trying to pull a kid out of Florida, that's probably a good trait to court in addition to his on-field ability.
If Oregon's trying to sell themselves as the right program for a guy who's a little bit more introverted and not a huge talker to the media, we had this coach a while back. His name was Chip Kelly. He's notoriously tight-lipped, and he has not changed his ways since then. But Young would have the potential to be another in a long line of really good running backs for the Ducks. I mean, you go back to Jonathan Stewart, and LeGarrette Blount was there, and then LaMichael and Kenyon, of course, and Royce Freeman, I mean, there have just been a lot of guys at that position, and Carlos Lachlan appears to be hitting the recruiting trail pretty well. He's already brought over Noah Whittington from Western Kentucky, so I think Duck fans should like what they're seeing there from that position, because I think it's a really strong one historically for the Ducks, and I think that helps with recruiting as well. I want to ask you about the defensive side of the ball, because there's a couple big-time names that Oregon has gone after. But first, I want to tell you about Bet Online, your number one source for all your betting, sports stats, and info this year. You can get all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's basketball playoffs and start of the Major League Baseball season. Bet Online is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. Bet Online, where the game starts. On the defensive side of the ball, where Duck fans, I think rightfully so, have pretty lofty expectations for Dan Lanning and Tosh Lupoy, not just because of their records as defensive coordinators on the field, but because of their records as recruiters on that side of the ball. And so I think that's, where we're kind of expecting most of the big-time names to come from, because Dan Lanning is a defensive head coach. So we've talked a lot about Jayden Wayne, but there are other guys who are in the crosshairs, so to speak, of Oregon's recruiting sites, and that is Mateo Uiagalelei and David Hicks. Let's start with Mateo, who's out of the state of California. He is the younger brother of DJ Uiagalelei, and Oregon has been going after him. He's an edge player. Where the Ducks stand with him?
The Ducks are in good shape here, and this was not something that we talked about 6 months ago. I was actually talking to his father, Dave, earlier this spring. I was doing a feature on the coaching carousel, just kind of resetting a lot of these elite recruits. And he said, look, he said Oregon's old staff was involved, but it wasn't like a priority level thing for them and how they interpreted the pitch coming from that coaching staff. He says, but now with this coaching staff, Oregon is kind of all in, which is certainly what Uiagalelei's family is used to, right? I mean, DJ was a top quarterback recruit. Obviously, Mateo at a school like St. John Bosco has been that since freshman, sophomore year. So they noticed a huge shift in Oregon. He also did mention USC in that kind of same light, where it's like previous coaching staff, okay, new coaching staff, it's a whole different feel. And I think that's obviously positive for the Oregon Ducks' chances in this recruitment, because this is another national one. The SEC schools are in it. Ohio State is in it. Obviously, Clemson is in it to a degree, given the relationships they have with the family. So this is a true national battle, and another one where anytime you can get a visit, it's a really big deal. But here's the thing. This one's going to go about as far, in my mind, as any other recruit in terms of the timeline. It's going to be a long-standing recruitment for Mateo. And I do think that Oregon having this positive impression into the new year is a good place to start, but you have to build on that with visits, with time, with coaches hitting the road, all of those things. And then you got to try to lock in an official visit. I think that is really kind of the next step with Uiagalelei. Can you grab one of those 5 official visits? Because the competition just for that portion of the recruitment is going to be heavy, to the point where I believe he takes off 5 trips and then makes a decision much later in the year, during the fall, maybe even all the way to signing day in December. So you got to be a player consistently with that whole camp, not just Mateo. And then you've got to land one of the official visits, which I do think Oregon is on the plus side of at this moment.
Well, the Ducks are definitely swinging for the fences on some of these recruits, and I think that's a good thing and something that they're capable of doing. I mean, we've seen that in the last several years. Mario Cristobal and company, and even going back to the 1 year with Willie Taggart, the recruiting profile of Oregon sort of changed, and we saw these big-bodied offensive and defensive linemen and linebacker recruits, and Dante Manning, a 5-star corner, and those weren't the sorts of players who came to Oregon, even back with Chip and Helfrich and Mariota. In those times, it just wasn't something that happened, but I think the perception of it has certainly changed for the better, because back in the day, I don't know if Oregon would have been after a guy like David Hicks, who's a 5-star defensive lineman out of Texas. And by the way, these are, some of the most notable and perhaps likely 5-stars that Oregon could get in the class of 2023, but they're not the only ones that the Ducks have offered or going after. So that just it gives you an idea of the sort of recruiting level that these coaches expect to be at. But Hicks is a big dude. He's a playmaker on the interior of your defensive line, certainly, and he's got a bunch of big names coming after him. You hear big defensive linemen, you hear the state of Texas, which is where he is from. You're going to think Texas and Texas A&M, probably A&M with him still being a recruit at this stage. And Steve Sarkisian hasn't brought in a lot of high-profile defensive players, at least yet, but he's also very early in his tenure there. So is this a guy that Oregon could reasonably bring to the West Coast from down south?
Yeah, this one's obviously going to be interesting, right? When you get into Texas, it's like a whole different ball game. But I do think the timelines are similar between Hicks and Uiagalelei, who we just talked about, because both of them are kind of like just trying to figure out where do I even want to take these official visits, much less where am I going to go for college. You talk to Hicks, and I saw him a couple weeks ago, and he was like, no top schools, no top contenders, no school's recruiting me harder than the other school. Like it's all like a blank slate, at least in what he is projecting. Now, we know Texas A&M has prioritized him for quite some time. They're going to be in it. Texas is in it. Oklahoma is in it. The SEC schools are absolutely in it. Miami is in it. But so is Oregon. Oregon is a bit of the outlier optically in this recruitment, but he just took a visit up there. Michigan State, maybe another one, 2 green themed schools that are really in this race, because it really feels like it's just the beginning for David Hicks. And he loved the trip. He loved the trip. I saw 2 interviews that he did. He mentioned Tosh Lupoy in particular. He mentioned Dan Lanning in particular. Just a good, positive first impression of Oregon, the program, what it has to offer, and the atmosphere, which is, I think, where you have to hit with a Texas recruit. Because when you're talking about a kid in Texas, his high school games, he was at Allen High School last year. Allen High School gets like 60,000 people at their games. You have to have an atmosphere to win a major metropolitan Texan recruitment. And that is true here in David Hicks's case. So I do think the kind of call to action that Dan Lanning built around the spring game was seen nationally. Certainly, it came across my desk a couple of times this past weekend. I don't know what the total attendance number was, but it was very positive, and it was kind of
At Oregon spring game.
yeah.
Yeah, just over 42,000.
Right. So spring game attendance is down across the board. Nobody's really selling out in general. And I think these transition coaching staffs, particularly with these younger coaches, are like, hey, let's bring this thing back. And they did a good job of galvanizing the Pacific Northwest crew to get over there to Eugene for the spring game. And I think that type of stuff resonates. He mentioned the atmosphere in particular. So I think that's where a big spring game with a created atmosphere is important to recruits, because now all of a sudden it becomes familiar. And you're like, okay, if there's 42,000 people at the spring game, what are they going to have at Autzen in the fall when they're playing, USC or whoever? So I think those little things can begin to add up when you talk about a recruit like David Hicks, who again is in no rush to even name contenders, much less visits, commitment timeline, all of those things. So again, I think these two recruitments are very similar. You're getting kids on campus, which is step one. Now, step two is stay in the game and see if you can get them back to campus for a game day or perhaps a summer official visit.
Yeah, I was talking earlier this week how when you have 42,000 people there, and then you give recruits a taste of what it's like to experience shout in Autzen Stadium. That's something that they hold on to, right? Because there are a lot of similarities when you go from this school to that school, and a lot of places have nice facilities, and a lot of places are going to roll out the red carpet for you. But you need something that can allow you to stand out amongst all the schools, especially for a guy like Hicks, who, as you said, is just a complete blank slate and could go really anywhere and isn't leaning one way or the other. But last thing I'll ask you here, John, these spring games are, I like them. I think there are a lot of things you can take away on the field, but, Dan Lanning has stressed, and I think they had a great success with making it a recruiting pitch, right? Like we've been talking about. How much can a spring game impact a recruit? Is it, just another piece of the puzzle? Can it be a major piece of, why they decide to factor? How big of a factor does it play?
I think it's a great factor, a huge factor. I mean, I think these kids have been really busy with visits since January, right? So you're going on junior days, which are really just kind of introductory visits where you're just getting to meet coaches, questionnaires, maybe you do a jersey swap, something like that, photo shoot, no big deal. Then you're coming for spring practice visits. So you're kind of an accessory to what we're really focused on, which is the spring practice. But after that practice, you do get time with the coaches and all of that, other players, you can hang out, all of that, jersey swap, photo show, you still do all that fun stuff. But when you visit for a spring game, you're getting that final piece to what it could look like to play at the school. You're still getting the jersey stuff, the interaction with the coaches, all of that. But now you're also getting kind of the final game day preparations. You're getting time in those meeting rooms where the urgency meets the timeline. It's not just, oh, here's another practice, we got a scrimmage, whatever it is. Like, no, this is it. This is the last showcase before these players come back in the summer. So you feel kind of that game day like build up and anticipation, and it includes time in the meeting rooms with your potential future position coach and the head coach. And then you get into the actual game day atmosphere. You throw in the fans, the entire stadium experience, and it brings more data points to the table. And the more positive evaluation data points you can get with a school, the better. Especially because there's only a few weekends where these spring games go down, right? It was like the weekend of the 9th, the weekend of the 16th, the weekend of the 23rd. Those are the three big spring game weekends. So if you hosted your top targets for your spring game, it's a big deal because all of those kids had options to go to 10 other spring games that day, and they chose yours. And then they got to experience all this on top of that. So I'm a big fan of spring game visit weekends built around that, because you get the sample of a game day with the preparation and the fans, but you don't have the live or die feeling from the coaching staff while you're going through those preparations. So instead of worrying about who's available for the game itself or the pre-game interview they got to go do with ESPN, now they're just worried about spending time with you as a recruit. So you get like a little bit of a balance. And some kids will tell you the spring game visit weekends are better than the game day visit weekends in the fall, because it's really all about the game for the coaches and the players those weekends. And in spring, there's still a little bit of a, there's less accountability for that weekend. It's not, life or death. It's not the end of the world. It's really another glorified scrimmage with an atmosphere. So there's not as much put into it from an X's and O's standpoint by the coaches. So they have a little bit more time with recruits. So I'm as big a fan of spring game visits as nearly as much as official visits, which is obviously the best that you can do from a school's perspective.
Well, we all love spring football and we all love recruiting, and that is why we just keep bringing you on. John Garcia Jr., the Director of Recruiting for Sports Illustrated. You can follow him on Twitter at @JohnGarcia_JR. John, great to have you back on the show as always, and this is going to be a weekly thing, Duck fans, so get used to it. You don't have to listen to me all the time, every day. That's why we bring on John. Thanks, man.
Thank you.
I appreciate everyone listening. See you next week. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.